All right, so we've had a lot of talks about things that inspire us in the industry. I see this as a panel about things that maybe challenge us in the industry. As the editor-in-chief in the Bold Italic, I come from a world where advertising was way over here and the revenue team was way over here, and there was a very strong line in the middle, and the teams didn't really talk. People ran ads in your publication and that was it, and the editorial team kind of did its own thing. And now that we have native advertising, sponsored content, people want something in the style and the voice of the brand, there still is that line, but it gets challenged, it gets shifted, it gets blurred, and it's very hard, for us to come up with new and different ways to engage with our advertisers, and to really keep the Bold Italic going, or keep any publication going. You really need to think about how are big companies and big brands wanting to engage with digital publications, but also how do you keep your integrity? How do you keep what you're doing smart? And how do you stick around? And so I have a lot of questions for these guys, but first we'll start with people introducing themselves and talking about what you do and how what you do relates to native and sponsored content.
All right, thanks for having us. My name is Kaye. I'm with Sharethrough. I run our publisher team. It is interesting because we deal with more than just publishers and helping them sort of monetize in a modern native stream sort of world. We also deal now with actually direct sales teams and enable them to sell native, sell sponsored content, and be more dynamic in selling things besides banners. So glad to be here.
Hi, I'm Grabenkort. I'm the West Coast Director for Quartz. I also oversee our business in Asia. Quartz is a global business website, so we're working with financial services companies, technology companies, increasingly luxury and travel, and it's my job to help these companies connect with our audience. And increasingly that's done through native programs. It could be sponsored content, could be display programs.
Nice to be here. My name is Amit Dodeja. I'm the VP of Special Projects at SimpleReach. That pretty much means I get my hands dirty in everything from revenue to managing client relationships for our publishers and brands. You could almost think of us as the standard of reporting and distribution for folks like the New York Times, Forbes, Quartz, Atlantic, as well as working with brands like Intel, IBM, as they start diving into content from reporting as well as scaling their own media companies as well.
And I'm Erin Scottberg. I help lead editorial strategy at Mediaco, which is the content marketing arm of Weber Shandwick. I help brands who want to use content, whether it's owned, earned, or native advertising, figure out how to tell their message, what they should be saying, who they should be talking to, and how to get it to them, and then also how to measure it.
Great. So I guess to start out, I'll ask a very general question, but what do these big companies want when they're looking at new digital publications? Do they want something where they can look at this brand and say, this is a really cool brand, let's just go with it? Do they look at numbers and say, we just want something that reaches X amount of readers? Like, what are kind of the big things when you guys are talking to these bigger companies that they want out of advertising in digital media?
I guess, you want to take it?
Sure, yeah, I'll take that one. I think it's changing. So Quartz is now 2 years old, and in the first year, there were a lot of advertisers who were just excited about something new. There's a lot of really great business journalism brands out there, but advertisers have been working with the same group for a long time. And so when a new brand comes into the market and they have something different to talk about, something different to offer, that's exciting. But increasingly now we're seeing some of the more traditional questions that advertisers have. What's your reach? What type of audiences are you reaching? What type of placements do you have? That sort of thing.
I think, just given that we have a bit of a bird's eye view into things, publishers obviously sit on this gold mine of data, right? And at the end of the day, brands want access to that data, but and the audience as well. But in this new environment, it's more about being really creative and really scaling with creative content, have it be video, infographics, any other content type that's out there. But also kind of the other side of the coin is not sacrificing scale just because you want to do something creative, right? Initially, when you really think about content and any kind of new format that comes out, majority of the investment is really taken into account of the creation process, right? And kind of the distribution side kind of falls behind. But more and more, we're seeing brands and also publishers really thinking about distribution at the same level as the creation process comes into play. So, as we're seeing things more and more, we don't have to sacrifice doing something really well, doing something really creative, and creating something beautiful at the cost of scale.
And I think it's a matter of purpose too. Like, why are you creating content? What's your goal? Are you looking for an awareness, or are you looking to maybe drive email newsletter signups? Are you looking to get a specific message across to a specific group of people, or do you just want to make people laugh? So depending on the purpose of your content is what that's gonna inform how you think about creating it and who your distribution partners are and how you're measuring that.
Yeah, I think just a quick high-level point there in terms of what brands that we work with are looking for. It's oftentimes an authentic conversation with consumers. Sort of the days of brands interrupting and stealing time from users and calling that a sponsorship are sort of over. And now brands are starting to realize that the only way that they're actually going to build a real brand that's going to be lasting into the newer generations is going to be by offering genuine content and making that connection, which has to be based on sort of like an opt-in model and rich content, and again, not banners.
Well, I guess to get a little more specific too, there's so many, of course, an advertiser will want high numbers across everything that you're doing, but if you're looking at newsletters or social media or page views on an ad or, pages in a specific story, like what are the things that really rise to the top of like, this kind of advertiser wants these kinds of numbers from this kind of social media or from this kind of metrics?
I mean, I think it ties to what the end goal is. Like Erin said, just because you drive 100,000 page views, is that more valuable than getting 10,000 page views if those 10,000 page views are more valuable and kind of accomplishing your end goal? From a measurement perspective, a lot of publishers and a lot of us actually, think about performance and success through the eyes of the publisher. As it page views, is it social actions? Is it time spent? But from a brand, I mean, that's not their end goal. The end goal might be to get an email sign up. The end goal might be a purchase. So it's kind of really thinking of content as the first step to build that audience, and then being as creative as possible and using other channels and also other content formats, have it be display, have it be video, to kind of continue that dialogue with the users that have actually shown intention and interest in the message that you're trying to get across, and then kind of walking them down that line. So, at the end of the day, I think it depends on what the goal that you're trying to accomplish, and then working backwards to really understand which KPIs are the proxies to understand what success is.
Yeah, I think kind of also looking at a real kind of high level of data too, there's a lot of effort that's put into sort of looking at engagement and figuring out what type of content is the best with what type of voice. There's this other thing that sort of has been a problem that's been here forever since TV or newspaper or anything else, and that is, what is the actual engagement with the content? Is anyone actually reading the article? Has anyone actually watched the video, or did they just start it and stop it? And so we've seen platforms like YouTube start to address this with, selling things on a true view, where you can be in a guaranteed sense that a user actually watched your video. We actually did a PR release recently as well, not to, talk about Sharethrough too much, but we've moved our platform to a 100% viewable platform where our brand sponsors only play for impressions that have been on the page for at least a second. A user has actually seen it. And that to me is kind of the highest level. Like, all these other things are super important. There's so much money and so much effort that's put into these sponsored content programs, but if you don't know that they were actually viewable, or anyone actually read it, or anyone got past 3 seconds of the video, it's a little bit hard to tell how successful that was.
Well, also, so thinking about demographics too, what's the hardest demographic to reach with sponsored or native content, where they're too cynical, or they just fly by it, and who are the easiest? What's the easiest target for that kind of content?
We did some research recently on CEO and top executive media consumption habits, marketing attitudes, and you'd think that they would be the hardest. And I was frankly surprised. Our research said that 86% of the 940 top executives that we surveyed were interested in content from brands. And then when you break down the type of content that these people are interested in seeing, they're interested in industry insights. So in the financial space, that could be a macroeconomic insight, for example. And then the second most popular category was your product, which I found quite interesting. Because who would expect that you'd want to read a product marketing message in a native content piece? But it makes sense when you think about CEOs and how they're consuming media and why they're consuming media. They're looking for an edge. They're looking for something actionable. They're not necessarily looking for for the softer side of content marketing, for a viral video.
Honestly, the idea that people want to hear about your product isn't super shocking to me if you think about it through the lens of people want to hear about what you have the authority to talk about. If you're a beauty product, you should really just stick to what you know. And you know, you've done tons of research, you have like the access, you have that authority, you have a lot of insights that maybe other people don't have. Previously, you would market out those insights to somebody else, to the media, to share your story. Now as a brand, you're gonna leverage all that access you have to create your own content. So it kind of makes sense when a consumer says, oh, I see a story about beauty from X, Y, and Z shampoo. All right, well, maybe they know what they're talking about. So it's not as hard to make a leap there. And that idea of authority and using content to share what you know and share your expertise and build that authority makes sense to me.
Yeah, I don't think at this point it's really hard to reach any demographic. You know, if you really think about what Facebook has built, what Twitter has built, even LinkedIn, you know, the amount of targeting capabilities that are at our disposal at this point, you could pretty much reach anyone you want. I think the real question becomes, first, understanding who's the demographic that you're aiming to reach. You know, what's really important to them, what's going to resonate with them, and tailoring that story and making sure that, that you have a clear understanding of the exact folks that you want to reach and making sure that you're building the content that's going to resonate with them. And then once you have that in a good place, then being smart about understanding where are you going to find those pockets of users, have it be CEOs on LinkedIn or have it be, you know, kind of the masses on Facebook and Twitter. Just the environment that we're in right now, I don't think it's the challenge isn't reaching a specific demographic, it's understanding who is the demographic that you're aiming to reach and kind of building the assets that you want that are going to resonate with them.
Yeah, I would tend to agree, you know, with those points and add to that there's sort of this other thing that's happened, you know, talking about how advertisers used to interact with consumers on the web and other mediums. Again, it was very interruptive. It was never the choice of the consumer to start a conversation with that brand. It was the brand basically yelling at the consumer. And oftentimes they would mute it, DVR fast forward, hit a new tab in Firefox or whatever you do. You know, at this point, the nuance that's changed is the fact that most of this branded sponsored content that you find on any of these mediums, Quartz or Facebook or Twitter or anywhere on the web that you'd find, you know, through like a content card, the difference is that it's opt-in. The user is reading stories, reading headlines, watching videos, listening to podcasts, and they see a headline that's really interesting to them. You know, could be a sponsor, a Hitachi on Quartz talking about, you know, modern materials and other things that are actually science and interesting, and the user opted in. So to me, that's just like one point that I think is a little bit underlooked in the fact that advertisers are no longer stealing attention and now choosing to earn it.
Well, as advertisers try to be more subtle about reaching consumers, where is the line? I mean, I imagine some companies really want to push and be more and more subtle. I mean, we even have advertisers ask us, can you just take that sponsored tag off a story, which we won't do. And so as these companies want to push deeper into reaching the audience, where are the lines that are drawn where you say, no, you can't go that far in trying to reach our audience?
I mean, I think it's the job for us when we work with our clients, and maybe, you know, we're in a great situation here where our clients want to be very positive. Hey, this is sponsored. We're telling you this. Like, you have nothing to lose by being transparent. And you actually, right now, and you're going to be found out if you're not. So you have a lot more to gain by just making sure, hey, this is tagged, this is sponsored. So the onus is on you as the content creator, the advertiser, to make sure everything you're saying, holds water and that it's honest. And the more that you kind of lean into that, and again, leverage your authority and really work hard to gain that trust, the better you're going to be. And figuring out how to make that case with your advertisers, I think, is a key point.
Yeah, I think there's a cool thing too where adding the sponsorship disclosure, which is obviously important and has to be there for consumers, is actually an opportunity for brands as well. Because if you think about certain brands that are totally transparent and have a huge splash screen and create awesome content, you think about folks like Red Bull and GoPro, where they're very openly disclosed, like, hey, this is GoPro footage, this is Red Bull footage, this is Felix Baumgartner jumping from space. And that earns them, I think, a lot of respect as a sponsored content creator. And so it kind of works for them, I think, in that way. Especially also when you think about, I like the comparison of thinking about Felix Baumgartner, the Red Bull guy that jumped from 100-something thousand feet out of space. Safe to say 99% of the people didn't really know that name or know who he was, or that jumping that high out of space was a big thing. But Red Bull made it a big thing with a big sponsorship. Fast forward just a couple months ago, there was a Google VP, I don't remember his name, but they did the same thing, and the Google VP actually jumped out of space from a higher altitude, but nothing happened. Like the Red Bull story just resonated, and people know who Felix Baumgartner is because, Red Bull has a really authentic sponsored brand sort of, reputation.
Well, another thing I'm curious about is with trends in the industry, who's creating the sponsored content? Is it more the companies where they have creators within the company that are writing and editing and sending it off to the publications, or do most publications have branding agencies now that pop up? I mean, for us, we act like we're this giant branding agency, but we're like 4 people that are also our regular editorial team, which is part of the challenge. And so I'm curious, with Quartz or with a lot of these other publications, like, who's creating this content?
I mean, I'd say there's 3 models for that. There's what you're talking about, where your editorial team also does the sponsored content. Back in the day, I worked at AOL, where that was how we made all of our money, where the people who are writing our everyday editorial content also created all the branded sponsored stuff. There's where the publishers have a branded studio where they're hiring a totally separate team that usually sits under the advertising department. I think Quartz operates in a similar way. You speak more into that, but where they then create the content. And then there's something like Mediaco, where we go in and work with the brands, and either we create the content with a team of established editors or writers, or we work with someone internally at the client to create the content, and then we work with folks like you guys to distribute the content.
Yeah, and we see it 3 different ways too. Either we create it, they create it, either the client creates it themselves or their agency, or there's a process of co-creation. When I say we create it, though, I think, and back to the previous question about where's that line, I think for publishers, it's really, and advertisers as well, it's really important to be transparent. I think it's at your peril as a publisher. Like, the only thing you really have as a publisher is the relationship with your readers. And if readers don't trust you, we know that they will go elsewhere. And so I think that's important. And I think that then that needs to bleed through into the content that you're making too. How it's labeled, who's creating it, indicating that it is sponsored. And it creates a higher bar for you. If the content isn't stellar, and it says sponsored, you don't have much of a business model. But readers will reward you if you're transparent and you do create good content.
Yeah, so I mean, I was just going to say that there's an interesting thing that we see all the time at Sharethrough, and that's the fact that there's really two camps. There's a lot, or actually, put that a different way. There's a lot of folks when you talk about creating sponsored content or branded content programs or coming up with something creative and interesting, it's oftentimes really difficult and daunting or just plain expensive if you want to have someone else do it. Certainly it's doable and a lot of people are very successful, but the thing that we've sort of helped a lot of brands realize is the fact that they've already created a lot of really great content, and there's just this whole legacy of years and years and years of stuff that's just sort of had a small splash on their blog page or people got really excited about and put in their email for a week, and then it kind of faded away. And this can include stuff like earned media. So, even content that they haven't created themselves, or it wasn't a little viral piece of something. Maybe a good story or example is we work with Jawbone on some of their wearable and fitness devices. They actually don't run any campaigns right now that are any of their created media. They don't have any kind of virality things that they're trying to ignite. They don't have any famous actors that they're doing for long-form video with. They're literally taking like all the best earned media and written reviews from CNET and other sites like that, and attaching their voice to it, very clearly disclosing that, hey, this is promoted by Jawbone on the CNET site, but this is a really great, authentic piece of content. It's a 3-page review with really detailed pictures, but they didn't even have to create it. They just decided to promote it and distribute it.
Well, along those lines, who do you think is doing native and sponsored content right? Like, who are the big inspirations in the field right now?
I think Quartz is definitely one of the early ones that kind of had that in their DNA. Obviously they were a digital-first publisher. They didn't have a lot of legacy, kind of traditional thinking, at their inception. Even if you think about, obviously the way that their site looks, right? They were the first ones to think mobile first, tablet first. And if you even think about it, they just started thinking about what their homepage looks like. They really understood what this new environment is, and then actually built a business model to take advantage of that. They know that majority of the traffic is going to come through side door, right? So from a design perspective, from a resources perspective, from what I understood, all of the resources were allocated to what that article page looks like and what that experience looks like. And then beyond that, it was just understanding, the audience that they're aiming to capture. And then once you kind of understand that piece, then you could start aiming to build what that editorial voice sounds like. And then obviously that takes quite a bit of time. So, I would say Quartz is definitely one of the first guys and one of the first publishers to really start thinking, ahead of the curve. And then you could see a lot of other publishers kind of following suit with the way that their sites look like, with kind of using infinite scroll, thinking about, mobile and tablet first. So yeah, I would probably say Quartz is one of the ones that really do it well.
Thanks. I don't create it, but thank you. I think that there's a couple things that make it an effective program, and I think the quality of the content is obviously one. It has to be creative, has to be in the voice of the, I shouldn't say it has to, but it obviously does better if it's in the voice of the publication or website that it's on, and how it's discovered is also critical. If you are having to drive people around to different locations as you would a microsite, that's a drawback because it's hard to get the clicks on the traffic drivers. But other brands that I think are doing it really well, I think Wired's doing cool stuff. I think New York Times is doing cool stuff. There's a lot of brands that are creating really cool content. I think it's a matter of finding the right voice for the right publication.
Yeah, and I think kind of, dovetailing off of that, an example that comes to mind, it's a little bit of an older example, when I say old, maybe a year plus or something like that. It's a microsite, I don't know if you guys have seen it, but it's the partnership between Pepsi, Mountain Dew, and they've made a microsite in partnership with Complex Media. And they created a site that's Green Label. And essentially when you think about, brand affinity and a publisher voice and, a message trying to get across with a perfect audience, really the stuff, the type of content that they perpetuate on that Green Label site via Complex Media is really just like dripping with authenticity, just in terms of matching the audience. It's Mountain Dew, so very often it's gaming advertisers, it's Call of Duty, it's extreme sports, and it's, some tough Complex Media hip-hop soundtrack in the background. So it's like everything is just just makes sense. It's all very cohesive. It's always a little bit awkward when you have like a brand message that's native technically and sponsored content, but it's on sort of a page that makes no sense for it to be there. So I just think that Mountain Dew example partnering with like the X Games is a super cool match of sponsored content and a publisher.
To ask maybe a really basic question, how do you get, if you come from a journalist background, how do you get in that mind of thinking like a brand for a brand? Do you need to, is it better if you come from a background maybe where you've been in a creative agency for a while or you've had some advertising kind of experience? Is it better if you're just more of a pure journalist and you've gone to J school and you can just put that kind of energy out there? Like, if you're trying to help build out that part of your publication, what kind of background and education or just skills in that area do you need?
I mean, I come from a journalism background. My background's in print magazines, actually, and then went to AOL, ISP, using content as a new stream of, as a new monetization method, you know, and then I went to startups after that. My background is almost purely editorial, and I don't know, I think you had said, how do you talk as a brand? I don't think the goal there is to necessarily talk as a brand. The goal is to figure out, how do I talk to my audience and what do I want to hear? And I think coming at it from a journalistic point of view and editorial point of view, you're like, all right, is this fact checked? Does this make sense? Like, did I talk to enough people to really come out here and say this with authority? And when you're thinking about that in the lens, like, hey, this is my byline on it, this is my name on it, I want to be proud of what I put out there, I think having a journalism background makes a lot of sense. I'm sure there's a lot of people who would agree with me, and yes, it is marketing when you come down to it. But coming at it from the lens of what's the story I want to tell and what's the best way to tell it is going to be helpful in any way, shape, or form.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just, certainly having a journalism background is helpful. I think that the other interesting trend is sort of this merge of sort of the journalism end of it, which is really the art, with the science. We see stuff all the time on our platform where there is great sponsored content or a really intriguing article, but sometimes, the writer just didn't nail it on the headline for some reason. And so we have a lot of technology that helps them really figure that out. So before maybe they go to print, or before they go do a big PR push or do a release or something, they test with 15 or 20 different headlines. And that's not, they're not shocking headlines or the 15, weirdest things you didn't know exist this week. It's not those types of things. It's, just different takes or different spins or different verbs or adjectives, trying to figure out like what lead-in will get people to actually consume and get interested in this content. Because those are kind of the saddest stories I see, is when someone spends a couple $100,000 or actually puts, their heart and soul into a piece of content, only to have, 3 people see it and maybe not watch more than 2 seconds or something like that. So, adding the science end to it, so maybe having a background that's more rooted in, funny enough, like optimization technology or, A/B testing among users or audience segments or something like that, becomes an important component of distribution, along with having just good content to begin with.
I mean, the New York Times, United States of Thanksgiving, I think is a great example. I know, I think Facebook did a write-up of that recently, but that's a great example of marrying editorial intuition and data science. And okay, let's take something that's debatable, highly contestable, highly opinionated, regional, and then use data to target and first do some research to figure out, okay, what foods do people make for Thanksgiving in every state? And then how do we engage people around specific topics on a local level rather than a national level? And I think I think Facebook probably did the case study on it, but it's a really interesting piece to dig into if you're curious about that kind of stuff.
And I have one more question on the journalism side. Like, how are you guys seeing people who are coming from the journalism field reacting to creating sponsored content? Because I feel like the writers that I know, which are mostly people from a journalism background, it's a very mixed reaction, where some people are like, yeah, I'm happy to write sponsored content. I understand that this is the kind of future revenue model for digital media. And then I know other journalists who, especially on the newsier side, that say, I never want my name attached, or I never even want, to ghostwrite a sponsored piece, because that is very different from, how I came up in the journalism world. So where are you guys seeing, how are the journalists that you guys know and interact with reacting to creating sponsored content?
I think there's a variety of reactions. I think some people have made the jump. There's some great journalists working at Salesforce now, working at Dell, working at a lot of technology brands who are proud of what they do and do a really good job. And there are others who don't want to go anywhere near it. We, at Quartz, we have a line between the two. We don't have editors or journalists work on any of the sponsored content programs. We think it's important to keep it clean. I can understand why other brands might not have the staff to be able to do that, and that, as long as you're transparent, I think it's fine. I think that the idea, though, my own personal opinion, so this isn't a Quartz opinion, is that the future of is about good content, and where that content comes from, I think matters less. And so if you're transparent about who's writing it, why they're writing it, why they're producing it, I think you're on the side of right.
Yeah, this is always an interesting question. I actually like to ask this to any journalist that I come across as well. Have it be on Fortune or the Times, Forbes. And kind of the common theme turns out to be they're not really worried about if it's sponsored or not, because at the end of the day, if you write an editorial piece of content, there's going to be a banner ad next to it as well. I think what they really cared about, at least from the folks that I spoke to, is what they're actually writing about and what's kind of how much work are they putting into it. Is it a challenging task that they're coming across? Is it a listicle, or am I spending 6 weeks to actually do research to come out with real insights that I'm proud to put my name against? So I mean, the more common answer to that question that I've at least seen is, it's not if it's sponsored or not, it's, what am I writing about? How much time am I putting into it? Am I proud of the work that I'm putting out there? And again, if all those things are checked off, I don't think they're too concerned if it's sponsored or editorial.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. It's all about the parameters of the content you're creating and how are you told to write this. Like, if you're said, hey, for this beauty blog, I'm doing the 10 best mascaras and the top 7 are going to be these, well, I think anybody with a conscience is going to have a problem with that. But if it is, what are the 10 best mascaras, and you're actually selecting them, and it happens to be underwritten by, I don't know, a makeup brand, or CVS, or somebody who sells mascara, there's still some editorial integrity there, right? So it's really about the rules and the parameters that are put upon you when you're assigned that content, when you're writing it.
Yeah, I mean, I would just pile on and agree with all that. I mean, clearly the substance and the actual content that you're writing about has a big influence as to how you, not that I'm a journalist, but, how you would feel about it. We have, clearly there's folks that, like you said, are just trying to sell something and use native or sponsored as a means of doing that. And users are smart. I think they're smarter than a lot of people give credit for, and they kind of see through that it's pretty thinly veiled. Whereas maybe the opposite end of the spectrum there is someone like Italic, who we work with on our platform. They definitely have a huge voice, and they're very involved in a lot of research, and legitimate things like trying to cure cancer is stuff that they work on through the Italic program, and create, call it sponsored content about how their technology aids in that research, but it's really interesting and it's really deep, and it has obviously a really important purpose. So as a journalist creating that type of sponsored content, I imagine that feels better than selling, mascara, right?
Well, switching themes a bit, how is the shift with how people are reading information, going from a desktop or a laptop onto their phones, changing the kind of native and sponsored content people are creating?
Maybe I can lead in on that one. So clearly the big thing is that, and a lot of people have said it, but your phone is the most intimate device we've ever had. And not just that, but it's also sort of forces folks to really concentrate on what they're consuming. You have to read each headline as you go down your feed. There is no right rail, there is no left rail. So it's a forcing function of, that real estate just doesn't exist anymore. So people need to rethink how to reach an audience and how to do that properly.
Go ahead.
All the content that we create is responsive. So we don't care as much about where they're coming from. We need to make sure that where they come from, they can consume the content in a way that is meaningful and efficient. With that said, it's important, I think, for the visuals, the interactives, there's a lot of things that you have to do on the back end to make sure that it works on mobile devices. And we're experimenting with formats and sizes for mobile-driven consumption. We just eclipsed 50% mobile traffic. So it's obviously an important part of the mix.
Yeah, and sorry to jump in again, but another theme around that is sort of the automation of sort of native technology is something that aids in that. It used to be if you wanted to create a sponsored content program, you'd have to spend a lot of time in Photoshop and send a lot of files back and forth and change the background and do a bunch of stuff. But at this point, in a world with many devices and many platforms and many operating systems, there are a lot of really cool platforms out there, like Simple Reach and Sharethrough and others, You know, and all modern sites are all responsive. So there is technology coming to bear that deals with these issues. And, you know, a lot of the native content is really mobile from screen to screen. So the things that we build at Sharethrough, you know, we call them content cards. And so it just kind of reassembles itself to be perfect, whether it's on a tablet or a phone or a desktop. So in a way, technology solves for that fragmentation, or it's starting to.
We only have 10 minutes left, but I wanted to have some time for questions. You guys have some questions? All right, thanks. So is there a limit to the amount of sponsored content a publisher can feature and not compromise its own content?
So I guess I just jump in. I think the answer is definitely yes. You know, very clearly in the earlier example, if you have a top 10 list and the top 7 are all sponsored, that's not very good. And I don't think that you're really fooling anyone in most cases. You might get some easy wins, but you know, it's not great.
And so within a piece of content, obviously, you need to be careful about, you know, what you're writing about and what you're favoring. But as a publisher, we also need to think about the amount of editorial content, the mix between editorial and sponsored. And we play around with the amount of sponsored content that will surface. But generally speaking, it's every third article, a maximum of every third article would be sponsored if you're scrolling down through a sort of an infinite scroll.
Yeah, just on the infinite scroll theme, again, not to toot the Sharethrough horn, but we just released a feature that works well with infinite scroll. And the interesting piece about that, I think maybe for the journalist community or the media community, is that when you know, that question exactly, like how much content should be sponsored, how many ads should be all over, what's the balance, that used to be something that, you know, a lot of people struggled with, and it was a real challenge to actually iterate on that. Like you had to go to a web developer or pull your SDK out of the Apple App Store and put it back in. And it's this real tough dance to move JavaScript around and do a whole bunch of stuff. That said, you know, we have tools and other networks have tools where you can actually control the location and the quantity of the sponsored content just by turning a dial. And so in a way, it actually is giving control to the editorial team to make decisions around those really important, you know, issues like that they feel are detracting potentially from their brand's voice. So there's literally a dial in our dashboard where you can say, I want sponsored content after the 4th article or the 5th article or the 6th article, and then subsequently every 5 or 6 or 7 after that. And you just look at the data. Again, you know, talking about the art and the science meeting, we have publishers now that are figuring it out. They're not guessing whether the answer is 2 sponsored content or 4 pieces of sponsored content is right for their audience. They're actually A/B testing and figuring out what works.
And for us, we're pretty sensitive about it. We only have 1 piece of sponsored content on the site a day. We started out as a site where our original boss said no advertising at all, which you can't really do at all anymore. But we have 1 piece of sponsored content a day. We're sensitive about the number of newsletters that we put out that are sponsored, because we're a site that's built on personal voice and opinions and personality. And so we really want to make sure that we're not flooding people with our sponsors' messages, but at the same time, you know, they're a big part of our revenue model and what we do.
You guys do a great job of disclosure, by the way, with your big pink sponsored banners.
I
like
that
those.
Bright
No,
pink
you're not
banner,
missing that.
So. How do small brands with small budgets crack the content distribution code? Most bang for a buck. Any tips?
Yeah, I think actually content is pretty much leveled the playing field for small brands, right? You know, especially for us, we work with everyone from an Intel to a startup that's producing, you know, bed sheets, right? And how does that company compete with, you know, the traditional guys that have been around for years that have already, you know, invested dollars into search and kind of build in their margins, right? So for them to even jump into any other channels and start driving traffic and monetize that becomes a huge challenge. What I think content has done is actually leveled the playing field. Right? You could be a massive brand and invest tons of dollars to write an article, and then I could be a small brand that wrote a great piece of content, and as long as that article or that piece of content resonates and really takes off with the audience that I'm looking for, it completely helps you out. And then you don't have to spend the dollars that you have to in search or any of those channels, given that you have this platform. There's this company that we work with, and we're pretty much the only marketing channel for them when it comes to driving dollars for revenue, and the only vertical that they focus on is content. And they've really made that distinction, and really understanding that content really allows them to jump in to any industry that they really want to, as long as they're really smart about what they're writing about, the audience that they're aiming to capture, and then, you know, from that perspective, distribution of it becomes a level playing field and could drive that traffic at incremental cost.
I would say figure out what type of content you can get the most mileage out of and what you can slice and dice in most ways and use as a, a landing page for your search marketing, use in your social marketing mix, use on your website, use in native ad plays, and figure out what do you have to say that's unique to you, that's going to resonate with your consumer, and then figure out how you can slice that into a million different ways to get it out through the Outbrain and the Sharethroughs and simple reach, and then kind of figure out what channel is most effective to driving, whatever goal you have when creating that content.
Yeah, I think also, maybe the smaller folks out there looking to do distribution that don't have these massive budgets are afforded that opportunity these days by way of just the markets of scale and, again, the technology. It used to be that you used to have just this massive budget to get your message across because everything was falling off the truck on the way there, essentially. People were changing the channel, no one was seeing the ads. You're paying on a CPM, it's just not a great model to be buying on if you're actually concerned about getting engagement. So now, most modern platforms, they'll let you buy engagement. They'll let you buy for someone reading or someone doing a completed true view or time spent engagement metrics. Like those types of things, actually buying the engagement versus spray and pray, which really as a small publisher or a small distributor or whatever you are, you don't have $100,000 to just go spend and hope that it works. You need to make sure that every dollar you spend, someone actually, consumes what you're trying to get out there.
All right, so we have less than 10 minutes. We got a little extra time. We have less than 10 minutes left, so we have 2 more questions. One, where does UGC fit into the strategy for brands and sponsorships?
A lot of ways. It depends on, UGC is tricky. It really depends on what your brand is and where your UGC content comes from. So are you using one of the many platforms out there that, lets you aggregate pictures from Instagram with a hashtag? Maybe that works for you. Maybe that's something that your brand's highly visual and that's what you're looking to create. And then really it's a matter of, okay, where am I getting the content? And then how is that performing against the rest of my content throughout, what we're talking about? You have to figure out the metric that you're using to consistently across all of your different types of content to understand what's performing the best. If there are a few different UGC plays that'll work for you, try it out. But I think it's kind of hard to give a blanket answer to where UGC fits in.
I would say a couple things about that. I think, sponsored content, we have these native units that are called bulletins, and it's like an article, and you can pull different types of content into that. So you could curate a feed, a Twitter feed, if you will, or an Instagram feed. And that's great because you can control it and you can still feature user-generated content. I think the dangers for user-generated content is when you've got comments enabled on these pieces. And a lot of publishers are just removing comments because they don't find them to be a productive dialogue there. And I think I would agree with that. Quartz's policy on commenting is you can comment at the paragraph level, but not actually on the native programs. And I think we tend to see more productive dialogue as a result of that.
Yeah, I kind of feel like UGC is actually becoming a lot more viable, in a lot of ways perpetuated by the new app ecosystem. And what I mean by that is that folks are in really a much more contextual experience at times, so that if you're doing it right, sponsored content can make a lot of sense there. And maybe an example of that is we work with MyFitnessPal, who's the top health and fitness app. You can track your diet, you can track your runs, and there's actually a social feed within that. So all the time what you see in there is, hey, I just ran my 5K, I had the best time ever, or I just made an awesome quinoa salad that's low calorie, low carb. And it's just stuff that's very topical. And so if you have Kaiser Permanente or some health food brand or something that has like a sponsored content message about how Kaiser Permanente structures their services or something like that, it's actually like an article, it makes a lot of sense. So even though it's user-generated content, people talking about their runs and talking about their healthy meals, if you're matching it contextually enough, it works. Whereas You know, if maybe we're talking about like an open social platform with no sort of vertical or alignment, that probably gets a lot more scary because who knows what they're talking about.
And you're talking about a platform with a community, which there is sort of super organic fit. Like, that makes a lot of sense.
And then last question, what kind of experiences do you think you can or should be linked to sponsored content?
I mean, generically, I think it can be really anything. I mean, we see people promoting all types of media. It could be video, short form or long form. It could be articles. It can be, you know, games or interactive media, or things that are even getting into augmented reality at this point. Like, really anything that's a consumable piece of content, if properly placed and properly disclosed, can work, I think.
Yeah, I'd say probably the New York Times did this really well with Netflix and Orange is the New Black. You know, aesthetically what that piece of content looked like was there was an interactive kind of PDF that was part of it. There were 5 videos that were part of that one single piece of content. There was an infographic with it as well. There was pull quotes. So, I mean, the thing that allows you to be as creative as possible is because you don't have those restrictions of that 300 by 250 banner ad to the right and kind of this leaderboard to the left. You have this entire space that you could do anything with and create a beautiful piece of content and really allow folks to engage with it, allow to share their opinions, have it be commenting, have it be voting. It really opens the door in terms of how creative you could be, and really removes the limitations that you have, especially that we've seen on the web so far.
All right, I think that's it.